part of the Unit 2 that is called The Age of Revolution. We are going to talk about liberalism. But first, let's see why did I choose this title, The Age of Revolution. It is a name that a very famous historian, Eric Hobsbawm, gave to this period because in just some decades between the end of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, many revolutions took place. And with revolutions, I mean real revolutions. So social action that produced deep political, social, and economic changes. These revolutions mainly took place in Europe, but also in the American continent, and to a lesser extent also in some points of Asia, all related in the case of America and Asia with the colonization that these territories were suffering. So in order to understand these revolutions, we need to understand what is liberalism. So in the Unit 1, we briefly talked about the economic liberalism of Adam Smith. Yeah, and it referred to like the free trade, the freedom to trade without having to pay taxes when crossing boundaries and without having a control from the state. But political liberalism has, although it has certain similarities, it is quite different. And it emerged from the ideas that appear for the first time in England in the 17th century, with all the process of revolutions that took place there and that established the parliamentary system. After that, after and during that, as a consequence, many philosophers started to analyze what had occurred and to theorize about it, and to theorize and create new political theories that try to that focus on the rights of the individual, the citizen, and the nation, okay, or like the group of people that belongs to a certain country. And they, so concepts such as the division of powers start to appear, the right to vote and elect for representatives, and in general, like having freedoms that are assured by constitution. Yeah. So liberalism is based on the idea that society, any society, is made up of freed citizens, not subjects. Okay, this is the big difference with the Ancien Regime. In the Ancien Regime, the people were subjects to the sovereign or monarch. ¿No? Las personas no eran ciudadanos, sino que eran súbditos del monarca, que era el soberano. Yeah, remember we had talked many times about this concept of sovereignty. So for the liberals, the citizens were sovereign. Okay? The sovereignty of a nation resided on all the citizens that were free. And they had inherently, so just because they were humans, they had certain rights and liberties that the state not only should respect, but also should protect. Because these theories come from the bourgeoisie, one of the most basic rights is the right of to have property, but also the right to life, the right like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of print, and many others. Yeah. So this is the essential thing, that people should be considered as citizens of their state, not subjected to anyone, that the sovereignty resides on them, and that these people have some certain rights and freedoms that are inherent to them. Okay, no one could take them from them. And the state not only should recognize them and respect them, but also do anything in its hand to guarantee these rights and freedoms. Yes, so we have the concept of national sovereignty, yes, so that the political power comes from the nation, all the citizens as a group are the nation. And then the nation, all the citizens, chooses who is the representatives by voting. Yeah. So this is, for us, it's quite evident, but or common at least, because you have been born in democracy. But it's something that we cannot take for granted. And we also have to understand that it was quite I don't know how to say, shocking in the 18th century to talk about that, to say that the ruler should be elected. The second concept that is super important is the separation of the three branches of power. So John Locke had talked about two branches of power, and Montesquieu added a third. Yes, so you already know, executive, legislative, and judicial, and they should be separated in order to avoid power concentration, and somehow absolutism or autocracy. So the three powers should be separated and at the same time controlling each other, okay, to make sure that they respect the rights and freedoms of the citizens. And as a basic element to guarantee this structure and the respect of the rights and freedoms, a country should have a constitution, a basic body of laws that establishes all these rights and duties of the citizens, the division of the branches of power, and in general how the state works. Yeah. So it is essential to understand, in order to understand everything that is going to come in this unit and next unit, we need to understand these basics of what liberalism is. In this second point of Unit 2, called the Age of Revolution, we are going to talk about the first of a list of the revolutions that will take place between the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So just to to understand the context, in the early 17th century, the first settlers from England had established in the coasts of North America. In theory, if you remember, all the American continent, with the exception of Brazil, belonged, according to the agreement between Portugal and Spain, to Spain, but Spain stopped exploring and attempting to take control of the rest of the continent quite soon because it was huge. And most of North America was left unexplored by Spain. Some parts will be explored later, but not at this moment. So there had been certain settlements, certain Dutch settlements, and also some English settlements there, that by the beginning of the 18th century had organized 13 colonies. 13 colonies in a small part of the east coast of what is now the United States. So the first colonies were the colonies of the north and had an economy based on small farms, of agriculture, and the trade with the metropolis, with England, and the southern colonies that were more recent copied the economic model that existed in the Caribbean, in parts of South America, and developed a plantation economy. So based on big plots of land owned by powerful landowners that use slaves as labor. So we can see here that there were, just to start, a huge difference between the colonies of the north, that were small owners working their own land, mainly people that had left England because they were Calvinists, and the South that developed a colonial model inspired by what occurred in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, but with its own characteristics, but somehow similar. So for British, these colonies, as the other colonies, were providers of raw materials. So because of this, they were not interested at all on developing industries there. So they wanted to extract the raw materials and sell them the British manufacturers. Yes, so they not only had a provider of cheap products, but also they have like a market to buy their products. So they held what we can call a monopoly on trade, which meant that the colonies were not autonomous to trade with other territories. Since they were colonies, they couldn't decide who to trade with. So although in theory it would have made sense that they traded with the neighboring colonies, they were banned, they were prohibited from doing it. And this started to arise a consciousness amongst the population of the colonies, realizing that they were not free at all, and that their economy was somehow tied, limited because of this, because they could only produce the things that Great Britain wanted, and to sell it to Great Britain, and then the rest of their needs must be covered by British products at the price that the British fixed. So they started to realize the views of mistreatment that their metropolis Britain was doing. The biggest problem was going to appear with the problem of the taxes. So until a certain extent, part of the local taxes that were paid were used to manage their own administration and their own governance, but they also paid other taxes that they started to consider that did not have any revenue. So they were paying taxes for Britain and they didn't receive anything back. And they didn't receive the most basic thing that actually was something that in the 17th century had become clear in the process to establish the parliamentary system in England. That was like this slogan of no taxation without representation, which means that if you pay taxes, you should be represented. This was an idea that was heavy embedded in the British culture, in the British parliamentary culture, but that they did not apply in their colonies. So the colonists of the 13 colonies started to protest and demand representation on the parliament, or they wouldn't pay taxes. So this increased the tensions. The intentions started to increase when the 7 Years' War took place and after. So this war some historians call it the First World War, because it was a war mainly between England and France, but that took place in America and Asia, in the colonies of British and French colonies in America and Asia. And obviously the expenses of this war needed to be paid, all that debt that had been created. So the British created new taxes as a way, to pay for that debt. And the response on the colonies that they had already demanded or representation or the elimination of their taxes, they decided to stop buying the British products with this double effect. One, not paying the taxes to that trade, and also reducing the income for the selling of the British products. So by the year 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act. Remember that act is a law. So that gave the English East India Company, I think we talked about this last year. So England and the Netherlands created companies, like trading companies. So the English East India Company was one of these. And they gave the East India Company the monopoly of the tea sale in the colonies of the West. So therefore, like limiting their access to, somehow limiting their freedom for trade. So their reaction was violent, and they started to protest. And the traders that at least until then, had been able to trade directly with Britain, and now had to lost their position because of these changes, decided to attack the British ships that were in the port of Boston, and they took the boxes of tea and they threw them overboard. Los tiraron por la borda. This is a very famous event in American history, and is known as the Boston Tea Party. So this was very symbolic, and somehow it was like a declaration, not of war, but a declaration of not accepting the rules that Great Britain was imposing on them. So in 1775, the war started, the American Revolutionary War started, so the war between the rebels in the colonies against the British troops. And soon after, 1 year later, they published the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. This didn't mean that they gained their independence in 1776. It was just this declaration with the representatives of each of the 13 colonies. Actually, the war was going to last way longer, until 1783. And it was quite a long war, and maybe wouldn't have been won without the support of France and Spain. Why would France and Spain support the colonists in a colonial war, being themselves metropolis of, so having themselves colonies? France and Spain at this moment, that were both Bourbon, had been trying to fight the increasing international power of Great Britain in many ways. So they found in this occasion a great way to try to decrease the presence of Great Britain in America. And although in this sense, the move worked because the colonies ended up winning the war after the decisive Battle of Saratoga, led by the General George Washington, later the first President of the United States. Britain ended up accepting the independence, and they signed the Treaty of Versailles. We will see how surprising is that far from being negatively affected, Great Britain would not suffer much negative impact after the independence of the United States. Great Britain continued trading with the United States and having a strong presence there, now as equals, or more or less as equals. And it had very negative consequences for both Spain and France in their own territories. So we can say that this support to the American colonies is one of the strongest causes of the French Revolution, and also of the War of Independence of the Spanish American colonies. So after the end of the war and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, in 1787, the Constitution of the United States was signed. That is the first constitution in history, and it was the first fundamental law that specifically declared the separation of the three powers and a free election for the members of the Senate and the Congress. Obviously, at this moment, it was not. We cannot say that it was exactly a democracy, because only white males with the right of citizenship could vote, and only later, as in any other country, other social groups, women and former slaves, etc., will be able to vote. So, in 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The fact that the United States was the first American colony in gaining its independence, although it was almost the newest colony of all the American continent, was going to be very important later when the other colonies that were Spanish or Portuguese gained their independence, because the influence of the United States was going to be always there. In this third video of Unit 2, The Age of Revolution, we are going to talk about the French Revolution. That is probably the most famous of all the revolutions that we are going to see in this unit. I'm sure you have heard about it before. Maybe you have watched some movie that make reference to it. So if you remember from last year, when we talked about absolutism, France was ruled by an absolute monarchy of the dynasty of the Bourbons, and actually more or less had created the perfect model of an absolute monarch with Louis XIV. So it was an extremely centralized and authoritarian regime in which from the times of Louis XIV, they had developed a system in which the nobility lived around the monarch as a way to control the monarchy and preserve the high authority of the king, but that was extremely expensive. They had built the palace of Versailles and the outskirts of Paris, with creating a model for many other royal palaces in Europe, with incredible and very modern gardens for that moment that were super expensive. And they also maintained many noble families just for maintaining that high position. So by the end of the 18th century, the situation had become more or less impossible to maintain for longer. So a series of circumstances just coincided and made the perfect storm. So if we look at the causes, the most evident is the financial crisis that the 7 Years' War had provoked. We mentioned it in the previous video, and in this war, remember that Spain and France both decided to support the rebels, the colonists, again Great Britain, that was their arch enemy. But at the end, the consequence for France was that ended up with a huge debt that needed to be paid somehow. At the same time, the summer of the year 1788 and the winter of 1789 had very strange weather, very humid and colder than usual. So the harvests were very poor, and that provoked an increase in the price of bread, the staple food, and this increased heavily the price of bread, and therefore provoked a series of rebellions from the poor people that survived just with bread. In general, as I was mentioning at the beginning, the French state entered into very high, great expenses and gastos. Everything that was around the monarch was surrounded by extreme luxury. As I said, the construction of Versailles and the other palaces that are in the same complex, the gardens and so on, but also maintaining a huge army, the most potent at that moment, and also a very well-organized bureaucracy with a lot of civil servants on the payroll, started to question the situation in which the privileged didn't pay taxes. So this opened for the first time the question of the demand from the king, from Louis XVI, of like if it was not the king in reality, it was his ministers who said that the situation was untenable and that the only possible solution was to make the privileged start paying taxes. They were only at 10%, the clergy and the nobility, but this 10% was the richest. So obviously, if they paid taxes, the income of the state will be a lot more. And the problem in general, therefore, was the imbalance between what the state had as an income and what the state expended. So they had more expenses than income. At the same time, we have a situation that we saw in the previous unit of a society that in some aspects had evolved with a growing bourgeoisie that was more important, better prepared, better educated, with new ideas of the Enlightenment. But at the same time, the division that came from the Middle Ages with the nobility and the clergy that were privileged because they didn't pay taxes, and this bourgeoisie that had to pay taxes. But at the same time, during the last century or so, the absolute monarchs had managed to subtract almost all political power from the nobility and the clergy. They had lost it. On exchange, they receive this luxury life in the Versailles Palace. But in reality, they had no political power or even social power. They had to be around the monarch, to maintain their position. And then, both for the nobility and the clergy. The clergy also had been losing power by a process or a way of acting that had started in the 17th century that was called regalism, in which on exchange of favors, monarchs started to decide, for example, point who could be the high ranks of the church. So at the end, the elite of the church had been decided by the monarch. So therefore, the monarch controlled the church. So the things had changed a lot. At the same time, the nobility and the clergy, since they had lost their political power, at least they resisted to pay the taxes that the ministers of Louis XVI had wanted to impose. One of the problems, one of the foundations of the basis of the revolution was here, this rejection from the privileged classes to pay, because this was going to force other movements by the non-privileged that will end up provoking the war. So, as I said, the bourgeoisie lacked of any political influence, and they were interested, obviously, on abolishing the absolute monarchy, because under an absolute monarchy they could not thrive, they could not progress more. And in general, the peasants in the countryside and urban workers in cities suffered an increased and of the taxes they paid that made their survival almost impossible. So they were going to be the ones that were going to explode in this situation, but somehow led by the bourgeoisie. And then we have the ideological causes. We have already talked about the Enlightenment, about the separation of powers that Montesquieu had stated, the ideas of representation in government, equality of all citizens in front of the law, the social contract of Rousseau, in which that says that a society agrees on like having a government, and decides who is going to represent them, but at the same time they have the right to put that person down if that representative or those representatives do not rule well, appropriately. So those ideas that had started in an elite had permeated to the rest of society. And then we have the American Revolution, that, as we said, was a great influence. Okay, it was the first revolution of this period, and although France supported it, obviously it became the first successful example of the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of the Enlightenment put in place. Yeah. So they, other people, after the success of the American colonists, other peoples in other parts of Europe and America started to look at it and think we can do something similar. So, as a consequence of all this, since the privileged didn't want to pay their taxes, Louis XVI decided to summon, remember to summon is convocar, summon the States General, the Parliament. The Parliament had not been summoned for a century and a half, since absolutism had started to develop with Louis XIV, or even Louis XIII, because it was a way to avoid the control of the representatives of the three states, of the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. But since the attempt of the idea of the monarch was to raise the taxes to the privileged class, they had, because they didn't want to voluntarily, he had to summon them. But at the same time, when he summoned the States General, the Parliament, a new problem came up, because the voting system, the old voting system, gave more importance to the privileged strata. So, because at the end, although we said that the nobility and the clergy were only 10% of the population, they had 2 votes. And the representatives of the third estate had only 1 vote. And usually the 2 privileged, in this case, they were going to vote together. Yeah. So this was going to create the big problem. You know, the evidence of how unfair was this situation. So what is going to come after this is a bit complex, so I will try to break it into pieces to make it easier to digest in the next video.